So this is Josef Harvard. Josef Harvard is a well-known Czech physician, was a well-known Czech physician, a specialist in the field of hormone research. And he was the head of a university clinic of internal medicine in Prague. And in a 1952 textbook for medical students, Harvard wrote, and I quote him, "We don't have a suitable Czech term for it. I think that there should be no objection if we adopt the term stress into Czech," end of quote. So stress, a term originating from English, had been increasingly used in Anglo-Saxon physiological research since the 1930s. And originally it had been used to describe organic changes that were induced in laboratory animals. For example, in rats, when they were exposed to more or less cruel experiments. You see here Hans Selye, a Hungarian-born physiologist working in Canada, holding one of the rats that he was conducting experiments with. And Selye found traces of what he called stress in the bodies of such rats, which he had exposed to cold, to various poisons, and other noxious stimuli. And Josef Harvard had been following this research closely since the interwar period, and his 1952 textbook, where he suggests to adopt this term stress into Czech, bears witness to that, bears witness to the fact that he followed research. Now, more than 40 years after Harvard's textbook was published in 1996, we encounter the term stress again. And this time it is spelled with one S in the end. So the term had been Czechicized in the meantime, stress with one S in the end. And we encounter the term in an interview that the Czech journalist Jan Hula conducted with the television manager Vladimír Železný. And I quote from the interview. So the journalist asked, "As a manager, do you experience high stress situations, or are you spared from them?" And Vladimír Železný answered, "Stress is a mobilizing and good factor. Those who do not get into stress at regular intervals fall into a state of rest and lose their awareness and focus." And when Železný was asked in the interview about his personal motto, he said, "We are like olives. The best comes out of us only when we are squeezed." And Hula published this talk in a book that was a collection of talks with managers, with what Hula called successful managers. In the mid-1990s, we also encounter stress in job advertisements. For example, in an advertisement from the year 1994, with which the American technology company 3M recruited sales representatives for its Czech branch. And I quote from the advertisement, "The only requirements for the job are university, high school education, knowledge of English, ability to communicate with people, and resistance to stress," end of quote. So note the change in genre. In the case of the hormone specialist Harvard and his textbook of 1952, we are dealing with an academic text that is addressed to an audience of specialists. And the TV manager remarks from the mid-1990s, on the other hand, they come to us in a book that was written to appeal to a broad readership, and especially it was written for people who were curious about the lives of those who were considered successful in the post-socialist period. professionally and financially successful. And perhaps this book was written for people who themselves hoped to become professionally and financially successful in post-socialist Czechia. And the job ad addressed a similar audience. While Harvard still had to explain a lot about what stress is, the two sources from the 1990s tacitly assume that the reader knows what stress means. And indeed, stress has become a ubiquitous term in the public language of the Czech Republic by the mid-1990s. It could be encountered across various media, genres, but particularly in urban and educational settings. So taken together, we can get an impression here of how stress transformed from a marginal and little-known concept into something considered normal and well-known. And we get the idea that this change took place in the period when Czechoslovakia was first a socialist and then a post-socialist country. Now, the rise of the concept stress is only one aspect of the story. Along with the concept, practices spread, practices that people used to combat and to arm themselves against stress. Around the year 1989, an influential ideal of stress control, ovládání stresu, gained ground among educated urban population. And this was an ideal that was increasingly to inform practices of work and leisure in post-socialist Czechia. The pharmacist Jitka Hořejšová, for example, became a propagator of stress control. In the mid-1990s, she lectured on Czech radio on the topic of de-stressing, odstresování. And she recommended practices such as getting a massage and fast stair climbing to work off the tension. And at Hořejšová's so-called School of Lifestyle, Škola životního stylu, which she founded in 1991 in Karlovy Vary, she trained health and beauty consultants who carried her messages further and advised clients on everyday stress management. So how did we get there? How did the concept of stress make it from Harvard's textbook on hormone research into the post-socialist job ad? And how did stress become something that some people began to take care of practically in their everyday life? And finally, what can we learn about contemporary Czech and Czechoslovak history from this? What does it tell us about a society that underwent the transformation from socialism to a market economy, to democracy? So to address these questions, I now move on to a conceptual part of my talk. And to give you an idea of the structure of my talk, so we're just through the introduction, and now we'll have a short conceptual talk, and I'll then go into more detail with two examples, and that will be it. So what was stress actually? In my research, I did not work with my own definition of stress, and instead I attempted to reconstruct what meaning the term held for contemporaries. And in doing so, I encountered a multitude of meanings and also a strong semantic change over time. For example, I have already indicated that stress initially meant a condition attributed to animals, to laboratory animals. And only later it became understood as something affecting humans primarily. And this is just one example of strong semantic change. And I can say more about these changes in the discussion. But in the period that I studied, there are also strong semantic continuities in the understanding of stress. And particularly if we focus on stress as affecting humans. So we can see something that one could call the conceptual core of the term, the conceptual core that continues to shape how stress is understood today. And you will probably recognize many aspects of contemporary understanding of stress when I now go into more detail. So stress was commonly understood as a burdening sensation that manifests itself in the body and even more so in the psyche. So the term stress presupposes an idea of the psyche as a sphere to be distinguished from the body. And stress was typically attributed to social circumstances, especially to time pressure and to the need to perform well. So stress was always about the relationship of the individual to his or her social environment. And often this relationship was about threat and about danger. But sometimes stress is also seen as an energizing and productive challenge. And this can be seen, for example, in the remark of the manager Zeleny that I quoted from, what he says about stress being a good factor that helps him to be focused in his work. So stress is not about a disease. Rather, it is seen as something that always also affects those who count as healthy. And there are also differences, for example, between stress and an emotion like love. Love is typically understood as something that has an external object. Somebody is loved, but love itself is often seen as building up within the individual and then becoming expressed. And stress, by contrast, is typically seen as something that comes from the outside onto the individual, that comes from the outside and takes hold of the individual. So in my project, I have analyzed how in the Czechoslovak and Czech context, in the period between the 1960s and the 2000s, stress turned into an object of societal debate and also into a practical lifestyle problem for educated urban population. And as a shorthand for this, as a shorthand for what it is that I'm interested in, I use the expression the rise of social stress care, also in German, der Aufstieg der gesellschaftlichen Stresssorge. So this is what I'm interested in, a process whereby stress became something that competent individuals were expected to take care of in their everyday life. And the job ad that I quoted from indicates how being resistant to stress came to be seen as an important capacity for a post-socialist person. And in particular, I want to understand how taking care of one's stress became important in the post-socialist period. But to do so, one needs go back to a socialist period as well. And I argue that by understanding this, we will also understand more about the post-socialist transformation, because the concern for stress and for becoming resistant against stress emerged particularly among people who were constructors and bearers of the new order, of the post-socialist order. This concern for stress emerged particularly among, for example, managers, entrepreneurs, administrators. It became characteristic of their lifestyles and of the way they work on their self. So how can we account for the rise of stress care? The fact that I began my talk with Josef Harvat and his textbook published in 1952 already indicates that in my approach, I emphasize continuities from the socialist period. So stress care cannot be fully explained if we look only at development after '89. rather, to a considerable extent, it emerged through development in the state socialist period. And in particularly, I'd like to emphasize the importance of certain social groups within state socialist society. And there are three such groups that I think are important. The first groups are consist of experts from the medical and psychological field, experts such as Joseph Harvard, who became interested in stress research, often by way of exchange with Western colleagues. And these state socialist experts and their increasingly popularized knowledge played an important part in the emergence and the rise of stress care. And the second social group that I consider important consists of a certain portion of young people who came of age during the Prague Spring and also during the 1970s and the 1980s, and who turned to such activities as yoga, meditation, and different forms of what was considered to be esotericism at the time, and also what came to be understood as alternative medicine. And around 1989, such practices that had taken root among parts of the youth in the 70s and 80s would often become linked to stress care. One example would be that the idea came up that yoga is not only or not primarily a spiritual matter, but also a technique that one can use to reduce one's stress. And the third group, is in overlap with the group of the young, and it consists of people who were referred to as brain workers, duševní pracovníci, in the late socialist period. So people with high levels of education who engaged in non-physical work, often in creative and leadership work. And among these brain workers in the 1970s and 1980s, there emerged an interest in forms of, for example, time management, concentration exercises, and such productivity enhancing activities as speed reading. And like the esoteric practices of some of the young people, these productivity-centered practices of the brain workers would become linked to the notion that one had to avoid or master stress. And this would also be around the year 89. Now, what is the place of neoliberalism in this account? The issue of neoliberalism appears to be important in my story. For example, when the television manager Železný, whom I quoted in the beginning, emphasizes that he uses stress to increase his professional performance, that he uses stress to squeeze out energy like oil is squeezed from an olive, then there indeed seems to be a connection between the stress issue and neoliberal form of dealing with oneself. And a short note here on the concept of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is sometimes used as a value-laden term in political dispute, and I use it more neutrally as a term that characterizes ideas which sustain a particular form of economic reform that includes liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. And I also use the term neoliberalism to characterize the subjectivity that emerges when people work on themselves and try to adapt to neoliberal reform. And indeed, there was a link between stress care and neoliberalism. And it began, the story of this link began before 1989. So the connection of stress care with an idea of working on a self that is competitive and performance-oriented This connection can be traced to the period of late socialism, since about the 1970s. And such ideas fit well with state socialist aspirations to raise productivity and efficiency in work life. So already in the late socialist period, stress care, the idea that one should take care of stress, became linked to what one would call proto-neoliberal ways of thinking about work, about being efficient, about productivity, about the psyche, and about the body. And after '89, such stress care that combined well with neoliberalism became much more widespread, and it turned into a central concern for people who attempted to adapt to the new order. But neoliberalism also is not the whole story. There also emerged a variety of stress care that was about leading a good life in the sense of a balanced life, a healthy life, a life that balances different personal needs, including needs beyond the sphere of work, for example, spiritual needs. And now to further complicate the matter, this second variety of stress care, the one that is about the good life, was not necessarily incompatible with neoliberalism. So you can strive to lead a healthy and balanced life in order to be even more, in order to perform even better at work, in order to increase your work potential. But I also found many instances when balance and equilibrium were seen as goals in themselves, where they were not seen as means to increase performance even more. So stress care, as it emerged in the Czech context, was well compatible with neoliberalism, but it was not reducible. And I'll now move on to the third part, and I want to give some insight into two of these groups that I sketched out, two of these social groups, and how they contributed to the emergence of the stress concern. And I will first introduce you to one of the experts, and I will then shed some light on the brain work. So we will not learn a lot about these young people doing yoga and similar practices, but I can go into the discussion. This is Jarok Křivohlavý. Jarok Křivohlavý was an industrial psychologist. So he worked in a field that was about the question, so he dealt with the question how work machines and industrial workplaces could be built so that they would, so that the workers would be able to use them well from a psychological point of view, that they would not get tired, that they would not get trained by the machines they were working with. And part of Křivohlaví's work since the 1960s consisted in visiting factories and visiting socialist enterprises and advising the staff there on how to arrange the work environment in order for the workers to work with less strain. And one type of workplace that Křivohlavý was concerned with were such monitoring centers, as we can see on this photograph that Křivohlavý took in the 1960s when he visited a thermal plant in Hodonín. And so it's the type of workplace that was new and still comparatively rare in Czechoslovakia of the 1960s. It was a workplace where one could feel the beginnings of industrial automation. And this was a context where the concept of stress made a lot of sense to experts such as Tschechoslowakei. This was, in essence, a stressed worker. The worker we see on this photograph, Tschechoslowakei, was epitomized a stressed worker. So stress here was connected to technological progress and to the increase of mental labor at the expense of physical labor. And experts such as Tschechoslowakei knew that such workplaces were, as I said, rare in Czechoslovakia at the time. And they also knew that in many places, the reality of work life at the time was much slower and much less shaped by technological dynamism than is suggested in the photograph. And because they knew this, because experts such as Tschechoslowakei knew this, stress for them was a concept that said something about the future rather than about the present. Stress was something they expected would become more important and would shape life if progress and technological development developed further. So with Reinhard Koselleck, one could say that stress to such experts was a concept it was more about expectation than about experience, also ein Erwartungsbegriff rather than ein Erfahrungsbegriff. And in the 1970s and in the 1980s, there emerges a slightly different version of this expert discourse on stress. And it emerges against the background of anxieties that were widespread among representatives of the regime, anxieties about stagnation, and that anxieties about the fact that progress might be stagnating, that the socialist country might fall behind in the economic and technological competition with the West. And in this version that now emerged, this version of expert stress discourse in Czechoslovakia, the new twist was that the future of stress had already arrived. The future is already the present. So this stress discourse was slightly fictional, and it's although it said that yes, there is now stress in Czechoslovakia, the essential message was the positive one, because to say that we now also have stress is not something that characterizes work life in the West. To say that we now also have underscored the modernity and the dynamism of state socialist society, especially against the background of these anxieties that what actually was going on might be stagnation. And now I'll return to Tschechoslowakei, to the industrial psychologist Tschechoslowakei. And one thing we can see in when we look at his case is that even before 1989, semantics emerged in the discourse of stress that can be described as proto-neoliberal. That in 1985, he published a text in the Czechoslovakian management magazine Moderní řízení, and it was a text about the mental health of senior workers. And in it, he informed workers about stress and wrote that they could increase their performance by work on the self, práce na sobě, For example, he advised them to use the relaxation technique of autogenic training. So this was linked to state socialist notions of productivity, but it was also a way of stating the problem that needed very little reformulation once we go beyond 1989. So after 89, we see very similar ways of talking about stress. And Křivohlavý also provides a particularly good example to point to continuities across 1989. In the 1990s, he became a prominent face of popular psychology in the Czech Republic. He often appeared on television and radio, where he gave advice, psychological advice on how to cope with everyday life. And Křivohlavý also became one of the first authors of stress advice books published in the Czech Republic of the 1990s. And at a later stage, we see how he also took part in the discussion on burnout that was in many ways related to the idea of stress care. Okay, I'll now turn to the second example that will shed some light on the second group of the brain worker. And this is David Gruber, who is a psychological coach in the management consult, and also an author of self-help book. And Gruber in the 1990s became known as a kind of guru in the fields of time management, productivity, and also in stress management. Gruber was born in 1955. He grew up near the city of Ostrava, and in the 1970s he studied at a mining academy in the city of Ostrava. He studied systems engineering, systemové engineer. So this was a study program that was designed to train managers, social enterprises. And when Gruber would become engaged with the topic of management, when he advised managers in the post-socialist period, he made a lot of use of what he learned in this very socialist study program. Gruber graduated in '79, and now there began a period of searching his biography. He was very ambitious and also quite restless, and tried different things in the early 80s. He worked in a control center of a mining enterprise, actually at a similar workplace as we have seen before with Křivohlavý. He worked as a travel guide. He tried being a writer, and he also studied at a distance learning university where he took a course in psychology and pedagogy. And one topic that Gruber grew particularly interested in were learning techniques for students, especially techniques that could help students to learn faster. And he came across a book on speed reading that was authored by a West German writer. So it was about how to train the eye to widen the eye span and to be able to process more information in less time. And the idea came up to Gruber that he could organize speed reading seminars in Czechoslovakia, and he did so as of 1986. With these courses, he particularly addressed young people, pupils and students, and also these duševní pracovníci, these brain workers, as they were called at the time. And Gruber was quite successful with his seminars that were often designed as one-week courses, And in the 4 years between 86 and 1990, he organized 100 such seminars, and he also acquired quite some publicity in late socialist Czechoslovakia. So Gruber had a TV show on his own on Czechoslovak television, where he taught speed reading and other work techniques to the audience. And he also made it to the front page of the most widely read youth magazine in socialist Czechoslovakia, which is the picture on the right. And Gruber developed a narrative by which he promoted speed reading. And he argued that contemporary man suffered from information overload because of the high progress of science and technology. And in this context, when speaking about information overload, the concept of stress made sense to him and came up in his narrative. So stress here is a condition where one is flooded by information, and speed reading as a practice to master this form of stress. So Gruber advised to go fast when facing stress, which was, by the way, in contrast to, for example, yoga, as it was often described at the time, where the idea was to go slow when facing stress. Yes, Gruber advised to go fast. And when we turn to the post-socialist period, to his biography in the post-socialist period, he made use of the publicity that he had gained in late socialism. And in 1990, he founded his own business, a company that organized workshops and published his own self-help books. And increasingly now, he began to target an audience of entrepreneurs and of managers, readers of such books. I quoted from in the beginning, where there was an interview with the manager, Schillen. And besides speed reading, he now also taught techniques of time management, techniques of concentration and relaxation. And he also changed the narrative by which he promoted his services. So he now told people that in the post-socialist situation, it was up to them if they would end up as winners or losers in what he called the competitive market society. And to be a winner, according to Gruber, was a question of economic and financial success. And he argued that one could become a winner by following the path of self-optimization as he, Gruber, taught it. And what he taught was a lot about doing things faster and about being more efficient when under stress. In 1998, one newspaper described Gruber, and I quote, as a person who gives advice how to master stress, how to concentrate, how to save time, and similar things, end of quote. And I conducted interviews with a number of participants of his seminar. And what they and in these interviews they describe what they have learned in working with Gruber. And when they do so, it is noticeable that to which degree they adopted his vocabulary, and also to which degree they adopted other discourses of self-optimization. So they say a lot of things like, I have learned to reach my full potential and to set priorities, to be effective. And also this notion of stress resistance, of odolnost vůči stresu, is very central in their account of their participating in his courses. Okay, so I will now sum up very briefly. Okay, that's here. So around 89, the term stress had entered the Czech vernacular, and the term had become commonplace, and also the phenomenon that it referred to was considered as something familiar, and especially so among urban population. And at the same time, around 89, practices informed by stress care had become established, especially among people who wanted to become aware of the new order and who aimed to adapt to the new labor market. People such as the participants of David Gruber courses. And some of the discourses and practices of stress care can be seen as following a neoliberal logic. But this neoliberal trend cannot be explained only by development after 89. It also, as I aimed to show, resulted from socialist development. It was closely connected with the history of certain groups of state socialist society, experts like Tschechoslowakei, intellectual workers like Gruber's students, and others. So the history of stress care fits the interpretive scheme of a long transformation that began before 1989. Long transformation is a term suggested by James Mark and other historians. And it is about a transformation that can be seen to a large extent as arising from socialism. And I would argue that the example of the emergence of stress care fits very well with this interpretation. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.